Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first podcast for Lash to the Mast. I'm your host, Rafael Scabola. Let's start with a prayer before study by St. Thomas Aquinas. Creator of all things, true source of light and wisdom, lofty origin of all being, graciously let a ray of your brilliance penetrate into the darkness of our understanding, and take us from the double darkness into which we have been born, an obscurity of both sin and ignorance. Give us a sharp sense of understanding, or attentive memory, and the ability to grasp things correctly and fundamentally. Grant us the talent of being exact in our explanations, and the ability to express ourselves with thoroughness and charm. Point out the beginning, direct the progress, and help in completion through Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, so to begin with, we'll start with a brief introduction, introducing each one of the three of us. Um, I'll start with education level and then confirmation saint. So for me, I was a senior, um, currently on medical leave, but when I was at college, I was a senior at University of Michigan, studying philosophy, PPE, and cognitive science. And my confirmation saint is Saint Francis Solanus, who, if any of you are familiar with Blessed Solanus Casey, that was his saint that he renamed himself after. All right, William.
Hello, my name is William Burnham Fleck, and I am a sophomore at Ave Maria University in Florida. My confirmation saint is St. Thomas Aquinas, and I'm currently majoring in philosophy, but my plan is to double major in philosophy and theology.
Nice. Okay, Jacob.
Hello, my name is Jacob Kubas. I am a graduate student at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland, studying history. I have a BA in political science and history from the University of Michigan. And my confirmation saint is Saint Stanislav. Wow, that's embarrassing. Saint Vladislav, the 12th century king of Hungary.
Nice. Okay, I didn't know that. Wow. All right. So
The reason why I messed up with Saint Stanislaus is because I live like 20 minutes away from his tomb, so I was there like 2 weeks ago.
Okay. Sure. No, I'm just kidding. Nice. Yeah, I'm kind of jealous that you're in Poland, and you're around all the church history there. Um, all right. So for each of these podcasts, we'll start off with half an hour of discussion on a random topic picked by one of the three of us, and then for the last half hour or so, we'll talk about a more structured topic. We'll start with for that one, we'll be starting with the Gelasian Dyarchy, or just the relationship between church and state, and how the popes and the Catholic Church teach that should go. The Gelasian Dyarchy is just the name of that teaching that is promulgated by the church. But before that, we're going to start with a very newsworthy event. So this wasn't in any of the papers yesterday, but it's still a very shocking event that happened. So yesterday, more than 2,000 innocent people were killed, and none of the media seemed to pick up on it. In the United States, unfortunately, this happens every single day under our very noses. And of course, the issue that I'm talking about here is abortion. So more than 2,000 babies are aborted every single day. And I feel like as a news station, we ought to be reporting this genocide like over and over and over again every single day that it happens. But I feel like even the pro-lifers among us have just kind of gotten desensitized about from this. But just to back up for a second, even if you're a pro-choicer, even if you think abortion is liberating for women, there's one thing that we cannot deny about abortion. It is one of the most seismic shifts in the history of mankind in terms of the family and the structure of the family. No longer, no more are no more do children get quote unquote get in the way of the relationship between a man and a woman. They can with the children taken out through abortion, you can just abort them. This allows for the trying to remember the word here. Look, oh yeah, so this allows for basically serial monogamy. Um, in college students, I think the average uh, number of partners that college students have in college is like 18 or something. And this isn't, and they're not just like dating, they're having sex with each other and most often aborting them. Um, so whatever you think about this, even if you're a pro-choicer, this since the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, this has been a seismic shift in our country for the last 50 years. So let's go over the numbers briefly before going over the Dobbs decision, which reversed the Roe v. Wade decision. So, as I said, over 2,000 abortions per day. This is according to the Guttmacher Institute, which is a research arm of Planned Parenthood. So they are pretty reliable on that. Um, there have been more than 63 million abortions from the period of 1973 until 2020. So it's not even counting the abortions that happened over COVID. Um, and in the last recorded year in 2020, there were almost a million abortions, 930,000. So we're talking about, yeah, 60 million people disappearing over the span of 50 years, which is incredible. Um, that is, yeah, that's I don't have any other word for that. It's just simply incredible. And then finally, Planned Parenthood gets government grants and reimbursements totaling 633 million per year. So we're literally handing Planned Parenthood more than $500 million a year. Um, and obviously, they don't only do abortions, but they are the main provider of abortions, and a lot of that money goes into abortions. So as taxpayers, we're essentially funding abortions, which is pretty insane. Um, all right, now let's go. Let's turn to the Dobbs decision. If you weren't aware, if you don't know what that is, that was the decision back on June 24th of 2022 which reversed the Roe v. Wade decision, saying that um, basically that abortion should be allowed in all 50 states. So the majority opinion, written by Justice Alito, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, what the opinion was, the Roe decision was egregiously wrong and on a collision course with the Constitution from the day it was decided. It imposed the same highly restrictive regime on the entire nation and effectively struck down the abortion laws of every single state. The Roe decision was remarkably loose in its treatment of the constitutional text. It held that the abortion right, which is not mentioned in the Constitution, is part of a right to privacy, which is also not mentioned. So basically, the he's saying that the pro-choice argument hinges on this right to privacy, which is not found in the Constitution. Um, so obviously, this was a big decision, and I think a lot of people might be under the impression that it disallows abortions in the U.S. or something like that. No, it just disallows um, it just gives the power back to the states on whether to allow or disallow abortion. So it doesn't actually say one thing or another about the morality of abortion itself, just that it can't be imposed on everybody. Um, All right. So now let's take a look at the aftermath of this. So one of the reasons why we're starting off with this, I live in Michigan, and we just recently approved ballot proposals along with California and Vermont to legalize abortion in our state. And for Michigan, it's pretty drastic. They get rid of parental consent laws. They allow abortion pretty much all 9 months. It's really extreme in the opposite direction. And then uh, so just going further on the fallout of this Dobbs decision, the Kansas proposal to ban abortion failed, but 17 states now have abortion bans to some extent. Um, all right, so there has been a pretty seismic shift there in terms of abortions, and that should probably that I would imagine that would decrease the number of abortions by quite a bit. Um, finally, let's look at the polls and say what the splits are on abortion. 61% actually say that abortion should be legal in most cases, as opposed to 37% who say legal in most cases. So the majority of Americans, if given a binary choice like that, will say that abortion should be legal in most cases. But it's really more of a that was based on a PEW survey, I should say. But really, there are the um, the splits there are more on a range. Like people will say that um, it should be allowed in certain cases, but not other cases. So there's a lot of variety in opinion there. So, but regardless of that, it's still quite shocking, at least to me, that a majority of Americans um, think that abortion should be legalized. Uh, and then finally, you're looking at the Republican Democrat splits. According to Democrats, 18% favor abortion compared to 18% not. And in Republicans, it's only 60% who say that abortion should be legal in most cases, as compared to 38% who say it's illegal. So that is why. And there's a sorry, I forgot to mention. There's a give me a second here while I track down this stat. Um, yeah, I think it's in. Well, anyway, there's a stat that I'll have to confirm later, but I think it says like 60% of moderate to liberal Republicans um, believe that abortion should be. There it is. 60% of moderate to liberal Republicans say that abortion should be legal in all to most cases, and that is why the Republicans have less people on the pro-life side than the Democrats do on the pro-choice side. Um, and then if you look at the numbers among Catholic mass goers and Catholics in general, it's pretty it's pretty shocking to see how many are for abortion, given that the Catholic Church says that abortion is murder and that shouldn't be. No Catholic should be allowed to believe that. So I wish we could. I wish we had time now to get into all the arguments between whether abortion is okay or not, the specific morality of abortion, and I think I would love to do that sometime in the future on this channel. But right now, I think we just like to stick. If William or Jacob, if you guys have arguments like that, if they want to present them, be my guest. We could also go in the direction of just the numbers and the effect of the Dobbs decision on U.S. Abortion. Or Jacob, you could if you know some of the Polish stuff on abortion, that might be interesting too. Um, and I think that's right about where my presentation ends. I was kind of a little bit scattered, but I guess the question that I'll pose to you guys is, what does the Dobbs decision mean for abortion in the U.S.?
Can I begin?
Sure.
Yeah, so I don't really, I would love to do a future podcast discussing the morality of abortion, but I kind of just want to focus on the effects for this podcast as for myself. One thing that I think is interesting is so the statistic you gave that like almost 60% of Americans or 60% of Americans want abortion to be legal in most or all cases, and I think that's not a very surprising statistic, because if you think about it, abortion through Roe v. Wade has been almost completely legal for the last over 50 years. So just now, like in terms of like legislative abilities, can it be limited? So I think that from the Dobbs decision, from Roe v. Wade being overturned, I think what pro-lifers need to do is use this time to start educating the public on abortion and its negative effects, and on how conception results in human life, and how human life is full is someone with dignity, and they don't deserve to be aborted. So I think that's where pro-lifers have to work from here, because I mean, in the 2022 midterm election, pro-lifers lost a lot. Not only in Michigan, but you also have like Montana, and that's a conservative state. And there was a proposal there that was shot down. So I think like we just need to focus on educating people, and then from there, that's where like once people become more pro-life, that's when the actual laws can be passed. Not that laws shouldn't be passed whenever we have the ability to, but right now it's out of scope in a lot of states. I feel like.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I guess I would also say like I didn't mention this before, but just also the fact that Planned Parenthood is selling baby body parts, and there's like a black market on that, and we're funding that as taxpayers. Like I feel like um, getting rid of the government grants to Planned Parenthood. I mean, even if you're pro-choice, I think you can see that forcing people to give money to an organization that they're religiously bound to disagree with what they're doing is
Mm-hmm.
against the Constitution and against the you know just against it's against our religious views, and it's imposing that stricture on us. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's just Planned Parenthood is just a really um sorry, I don't want to be I want to get like invective here, or um uh I don't want to be uh gosh, I'm forgetting the word. I don't want to be like um non logical here, or just throwing out emotions, but Planned Parenthood is really like a terrible organization. Like
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about just mass, even if you don't think it's mass murder, like just the fact that they're selling baby body parts and ripping body parts off of kids in the womb to make sure that they're like fresh and stuff. Like it's horrible. It's horrible.
Yeah.
And if you don't believe it, I mean, you can go take a look at the pictures and stuff, and then make up your own
Mm-hmm.
mind. But at least don't force us to have to pay for that.
Yeah. I feel like though this goes back to like most people just aren't even aware that this stuff is going on. Like
Mm,
I know so many people that were pro-choice and supported abortion rights, but then they found out like what abortion actually does, and like the history behind it, and everything like Planned Parenthood does, and that and being like and being aware of that, they then became pro-life.
yeah, yeah. I
So,
mean, there was a recent movie that came out too about the abortionist who turned around. Do you have any thoughts,
yeah.
Jacob? Or sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the previous question about what does Dobbs mean for the pro-life, pro-choice debate, I agree with William, but the thing is, what Dobbs does is it creates liberty for bastions of the pro-life movement, specifically states in the Bible Belt,
Yeah,
to actually legislate pro-life legislature, and then from there, those can actually become hubs of pro-life activism that can actually influence public opinion outside of those states and across the country. Whereas previously we kind of had to live under the Roe versus Wade regime, where it was all abortion was available and had to be available in all 50 states. Now the other thing is, I mean, you mentioned how shocking that so many Catholics seem to be on the pro-choice side. I don't know if that's entirely that surprising. I mean, only 1/3 of Catholics believe in the real presence. I mean, are let alone the social teaching of the Catholic Church. But more to the point of Dobbs, there was one more thing that I had to say, but it kind of slipped my mind right now. Maybe it'll come back to me in a few moments, but that's all I have for now.
Sure. Does Poland have any abortion? Do they allow abortion?
So in Poland, we actually try to make our abortion laws more restrictive than they already are. Currently, the law is that abortion is only allowed in cases of rape and incest, and when the mother's life is in danger.
Oh, wow.
And that amounts to about 127 abortions per year in the entire country.
Dang. So bad, but that's
yes. However, when you look at that and you exclude, health of the mother as well as life endangering defects of the child, right? So there is a sort of eugenic abortion is allowed in Poland.
Oh, wow.
And so of those 127 annual abortions or thereabouts, that's a statistic from I think 2012. Of those 127, 98% of those are eugenic abortions.
Wow. Wow. Okay.
So because the child has Down syndrome or something like that.
Wow.
And only the other 2%, so what is that, like 3-4 abortions per year are actually caused because the mother's life is in danger, or because she was raped, or because it's a case of incest.
Wow.
And that is actually horrifying, because that means that we accept the murdering of children just because they have Down syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
A few years ago, I think it was about 2, maybe 4 years ago, the current government tried to tighten legislation on abortion and make it, I believe, only so that it would be cases of rape and incest. And like 200,000 feminists went into the streets protesting. It was the famous Black protest throughout the country, mostly in the capital, but throughout the country, and the government backed down.
Wow.
And I mean, am I entirely surprised that the government backed down? Not really. It was a fairly large protest. There's a lot of pressure, including from the EU and from the UN and from the United States. The ambassador of the United States, of the state of Israel. And so they backed down. But what horrifies me is the fact that despite this being a 98% eugenics issue, not even positive eugenics, but a negative eugenics issue, so we're removing people from the gene pool, undesirables, people are fine with that and are willing to get behind that cause in such large numbers.
Wow. Yeah.
That is horrifying to me.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah. I mean, when you get down to it, it seems like a lot of the arguments for abortion are based on that premise. You know, getting rid of... I was just reading an online argument today about abortion, and people, like... This one person made an argument based on them being like a lot of kids being unwanted once they're born.
Mm.
And
Wow.
it's just like, that's just how a lot of people think.
It's absolutely mind-boggling. I mean, what is the logic there? It is better to be murdered than to be unwanted.
Yeah.
Man, I guess I hadn't connected um, the unwanted argument with the eugenic argument, but I guess that makes sense that it is a eugenic argument in the sense that like they're arguing that yeah, there's nobody to take care of them because they were born into circumstances that were usually poor or something like that. Um,
hmm and we're also this is maybe a little bit off topic, but it's kind of related because it's something we could all see is like with Canada, euthanasia is now becoming a really big thing,
oh
and they use similar arguments. Um, and I think those arguments are only going to become increased because I think I read a statistic that like for the first time in human history, in a lot of places we have more 65-year-olds than 5-year-olds.
wow,
So there aren't going to be enough people to take care of the elderly.
wow,
So then those people become unwanted.
wow, that's crazy.
One thing that does come to mind, I think, with the general demographic crisis of Western developed nations, you run into the issue of a smaller and smaller pool of people paying into Social Security, which then funds retirement pensions for the people that are already elderly. So one way to get out of that, or at least to alleviate the issue, is to, of course, decrease the number of pensioners by promoting things like, uh, let's say, I'm struggling to find a delicate way of saying euthanasia, but by giving them a dignified a dignified death is what they call it, I suppose, or dignified end of life care.
Yeah, and I mean on this topic, like COVID-19, when it hit, like medical professionals were making decisions on who deserved care and who didn't deserve care, pretty much based on the premise of like natural, like their bodily health, like that was the thing that was most important. So if you're like a
Well,
yep, go ahead.
go on, finish your
Well, I was gonna
finish
say,
your thought, please.
yeah, I heard this at a talk um, given by someone at U of M, and they were saying that um, yeah, like if you're a 30-year-old who is struggling with COVID versus like a 65-year-old, they're probably going to give more care to the 30-year-old because he's 30 and he's more vigorous, I guess. But yeah, go ahead, Jacob.
Well, the thing about that is we've had protocols like this in place at least since World War II, and that is basically you give care to the person that is most likely to survive.
Yeah, I guess that's a good
Um,
point.
and I think that that's valid. There's also the more materialistic argument, which is society is going to get more material benefit out of the 30-year-olds, next 50 years of life rather than the 60-year-olds next 20.
Yeah, I get that, but I don't know that that should
I mean,
equate to any.
that's a very cold and calculated and materialist way of looking at it, but I mean that is the truth. But I mean, the other thing is the fact that we've had these procedures in place to preserve the lives of those that are most likely to survive for decades.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, William.
Couldn't because with like the giving the healthcare to people, I mean, I don't know exactly the exact situations, but wouldn't it make more sense to give it to the elderly people because I mean, younger people are more likely to survive COVID. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there is the issue of like risk assessment. Like, does an untreated person have a disproportionate a untreated young person have a disproportionately higher chance of COVID being lethal than a treated or untreated elderly person, and you have to kind of judge like what the differences are and whether they're proportionate to the age difference, the survivability, the cost, etc. And that's not something that can be easily done, especially not on the spot. I mean, I'm sure someone could probably think of like a mathematical model for it, but I don't think anyone has, and if they have, it probably hasn't been used in the emergency room.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm a little sketched out by mathematical models like that. Um, I think, yeah, I think, I guess COVID-19 is kind of special in the sense that it really only disproportionately affected older people. I mean, it affected young people with pre-existing conditions. Um, but yeah, I guess um, it's just the point that speaker was making was that this mindset in the medical community that um, the that um, adults like in full health are worth more than like kids or like elderly is, yeah, it's kind of a pervasive thing in the medical community. Um, I mean, I guess we're wandering kind of far afield here, but the main reason why I brought up COVID-19 was just to float the conspiracy theory out there that that was euthanasia for the Americans. But no, I'll just I'll stop there before I get into any more hot water. So going back to the abortion case, do we have any concluding thoughts on that, or anything else people want to say?
Well, I think one thing I think maybe we could talk about sort of the history of philosophy or the philosophy of history rather. Um, what kind of consequences is this going to have for America? Because one thing that always comes to mind in the abortion debate and in the philosophy of history is the fate of Poland during World War II. Um, Poland legalized abortion in 1926. It was the first country in Europe, aside from the Soviet Union, to legalize abortion. Warsaw became the abortion capital of Europe.
Wow.
It was quite liberal, quite readily available, and generally Warsaw in the 1920s and 30s was comparable in its level of degeneracy to Weimar Berlin, which isn't very often spoken of. But what happens, 20, 30 years later? In 1944, Warsaw is wiped off the face of the earth by the Germans. 89% of the city is destroyed.
Right.
And you have to kind of consider in a sort of cosmic narrative of history whether or not this isn't some kind of divine retribution for the sins of the 30s and 20s. And then you have to ask the question: when we have abortion in the United States to a level that has never been practiced in the history of at least since modern history, at least since the end of antiquity, where you can abort a child the day before it leaves the womb, or even minutes before it leaves the womb, or the birth canal even. Like, that is an egregious crime against nature. What kind of divine retribution are we in for if we don't repent in time?
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. Like obviously we can never exactly know, but we can be sure that God's divine providence is watching over all things, and that yeah, I mean if you look in the Bible, like that is clearly something that is is done to
Mhm.
like peoples and cities that don't repent. And I think in our case, I think I heard a quote well, why did God leave our society? Because we said we didn't want him, and like a gentleman, he stepped out or something like that. Um, and it's sort of like I think we're experiencing that stepping out right now, with just in terms of yeah. Probably not the time to go into more broader issues, but um, yeah,
Mhm.
like abortion, it should be the number one issue on our minds, um, in terms of trying to turn this country around into trying to turn this country around. We could also talk about how abortion is kind of flows out of a contraceptive mindset, maybe, but that would probably take too long here. So I guess William, do you have any concluding thoughts?
No, I mean, I was just gonna go off what you said a little bit and say, you know, it's quite possible with abortion being made, legal back in the 60s, right? Early 70s.
Yeah, 1973.
Not sure. Yeah, 1973. So, I mean, all these other issues that are affecting our country, the I don't want to get too much into it in this
Right.
podcast, but gender and sexuality. Um, it's possible, that stuff is God is allowing that stuff, like He does in Romans. He hardens their hearts. The first chapter of Romans,
Yeah.
and it's possible that all these social ills are now affecting America because we allowed all this evil to continue.
Yeah. Good point. All right. I think with that, we'll end this section of the podcast and turn to the next section. Yeah. Thank you guys both for your thoughts on that. That was a really substantive discussion. Um, all right. So this presentation section of the podcast is going to be on the introduction to the Gelasian Dyarchy, which is the church's teaching on the relationship between church and state. All right, let me see if I can do justice to. So I'm going to be basically shamelessly plagiarizing an article written by Edmund Waldstein of the Order of the Cistercians on this. So definitely we'll link that in the description below, and definitely give a shout out to him and the Josias. Would highly recommend that website. Um, but yeah, I did add some more things of my own and stuff. So hopefully this will be comprehensible. All right, so if we go back to antiquity, so before considering Catholic teaching on this topic, what did the ancients think the end of man was, like the temporal end? So if we look at Aristotle, just because he's obviously greater than all the other ancient philosophers, um, he says that there must be some final end for which all other ends meet up. So, like, if you're driving a car, like the end of driving a car isn't to drive the car. Like, you're not just driving; you're trying to get somewhere, and that is the final end. Um, yeah. So, um, and then Aristotle says man is a political animal. And then he goes on to claim, for even if the end is the same for a single man and for a state, that of the state seems at all events something greater and more complete. So what he's saying is that man's temporal ends for which he was made is to be found among other people in his society. Um, that uh, and this sort of idea is called the common good. So what is a common good? People usually think of like economic goods as being a zero sum game. Like you can't have an ice cream. Like if a boy has an ice cream cone, there's only so much of that ice cream cone that can go around. Like you can't make there's no way to like multiply it so that more people can enjoy it. But something like the sun would be a common good because your enjoyment of the sun does not take away from the enjoyment of other people of the sun. Um, so the sun would be something like a common good. And this is Aristotle's idea of the state as well, that the state would be a sort of common good for the people and would have things like, for example, install streetlights and roads. Your use of the road doesn't impede anybody else's use of the road, or your enjoyment of lighting doesn't intrude upon anybody else's enjoyment of the lighting. So that all makes sense, and it makes sense that humans' good is to be that our end is to be found in something outside of ourselves. But when we examine Christianity, this it sort of seems to contradict this because this is purely like a temporal view of how things should be, according to Aristotle. However, in Christianity, we see that salvation from this valley of tears is paramount. Um, and then, according to Waldstein, the teaching of the of Christianity on this is in terms of the temporal and spiritual realms. This is what he says: the question of the relation of spiritual to temporal power is intimately connected to the question of the relation between nature and grace. Christianity is able to distinguish between the two powers because it is a religion of grace, which does not destroy the order of nature, but presupposes, elevates, and perfects it. So we can see that even though Christianity has a spiritual end and not necessarily a temporal one, it's still the temporal end is actually still necessary for the completion of the spiritual end. And so once again, that temporal end almost becomes like is not the final end, but becomes like sort of an immediate end to the spiritual end, like I was talking about in terms of driving the car, like that temporal end of men living in a society through virtue is the driving of the car towards the spiritual end of heaven. Thus, Aristotle's account of Christianity does not destroy Aristotle's, but rather perfects it. Um, all right, so let's look at this in a specifically Catholic context. Though we have an idea that the spiritual end is that the temporal end is supposed to be integrated in some way with the spiritual end, but not exactly how. So the Catholic teaching on this goes all the way back to the early 490s, in a letter that Pope Gelasius I wrote to the Emperor Anastasius. In this letter, Pope Gelasius famously says, "There are two august emperor by which this world is chiefly ruled, namely, the sacred authority of the priests and the royal power. Of these, that of the priests is weightier, since they have to render an account for even the kings of men in the divine judgment. You are also aware, most clement son, that while you are permitted honorably to rule over humankind, yet in divine matters you bend your neck devotedly to the bishops and await from them the means of your salvation. In the reception and proper disposition of the heavenly sacraments, you recognize that you should be subordinate rather than superior to the religious order, and that in these things you depend on their judgment rather than wish to bend them to your will." So let me just read the last part again because that's pretty bold. In the reception and proper disposition of the heavenly sacraments, you recognize that you should be subordinate rather than superior to the religious order, and that in these things you depend on their judgment rather than wish to bend them to your will. So this nature grace duality, in this nature and grace duality, we see that the temporal needs to be subordinate to the spiritual. Um, and then unpacking this, Edmund Waldstein, the author of this article, argues that this is a diarchy, i.e., the uniqueness of the role of the state and of the church, is to be found in Scripture when Christ commands to Caesar, to the Pharisees, to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to render unto God the things that are God's. So let's go back to Gelasius' quote really quick and just unpack what diarchy means, because it's kind of a it's probably a new term for most people. So it's a Catholic teaching on this point has teaches that there's a diarchy between the church and state and not a monarchy. So a monarchy, mon is the root for one in Latin, as something like it's based off of, I don't remember what the full word is, but then the die on the diarchy, the die means two. Um, And there's two, as Gelasius said, there are two by which this world is chiefly ruled. There are two, the spiritual and temporal, um, meaning that each derives their power immediately from God, rather than the temporal having its power only through the spiritual. So, but even though the temporal power is in a way like independent from the spiritual power, its power is only legitimate if it submits to the spiritual. Um, and this is what Waldstein says. And yet the diarchical element derived from Gelasius was always preserved. At times, the medieval popes seemed to deny the Gelasian teaching by saying that the temporal power is derived not immediately from God, but rather immediately through the spiritual power. A careful reading, however, shows that this is not the case. The temporal powers derived from God, however, can only have legitimacy if it submits itself to the spiritual power, which has carried the final end. So he's echoing what Gelasius said, that the temporal power has to subordinate itself to the spiritual. All right. Give me a second here. All right. So a question that immediately comes to mind here: why in the world would God establish two powers here? Why would He make a diarchy instead of a monarchy? Um, Well, we saw earlier that grace perfects nature, and that nature is incapable of reaching the spiritual end of man, which is, according to St. Thomas, the beatific vision of God in the next life. So that end is only achievable in the next life. So it makes sense then that the church should govern over matters pertaining to the salvation of souls, but why then shouldn't the church govern over temporal things as well? In another text by Pope Gelasius I, called Tractate 4, we see this diarchy of the spiritual and the temporal exists because of sin. Because of sin and human pride, as Gelasius says, it is necessary for the spiritual power to give up care of earthly matters to the temporal power, and that is why it is taught that those warring for spiritual things should not be entangled with secular things. And we see this in Christ's rebuke of Peter: those who live by the sword shall die by the sword. The flip side of this then also, though, is that without the effects of sin, there would be no need to separate the spiritual and temporal power, and thus the spiritual power would reign supreme in a more monarchical sense than a diarchical sense. Um, all right, so I'm just going to stop there. The rest of what I have is the popes just confirming this teaching. Um, and yeah, I'm sorry if that was slightly confusing, or more than slightly confusing. But what do you guys think on the presentation? You can disagree with how I framed it, I guess, having read the article yourselves.
Hmm.
I can go
Would you like
first.
to begin, Jacob?
Well, I do have some questions
Sure.
with regard to the Gelasian Dyarchy as it relates to later medieval papal teaching. For example, Unam Sanctam and Dictatus Papae, in the opposite order because Dictatus Papae was written before. But anyway, so how does the development of the doctrine of the Petrine office work in this context? Because on one hand we have the early teaching or the earlier teaching of Pope Gelasius, where we do have the diarchy, and then later on with St. Peter Damian, we have the investiture controversy, and St. Peter Damian begins appealing to the Holy Roman Emperor and explaining that yes, there are two swords, but the spiritual and the temporal, but the temporal is handed to the temporal power by the spiritual power. And then in Dictatus Papae, we get a which is written around that time in 1075. We get the foundation of the idea of Caesaropapism. So again, the superiority of the Pope over the Emperor, and that the temporal power stems from the spiritual power. It is necessary to get the approval of the Pope, not only for the investiture of bishops, but also for the anointing and crowning of temporal kings, which was previously considered to be the prerogative of the emperor. And then, of course, Unam Sanctam, we sort of see a confirmation of that. So I was just wondering how we look at this and we sort of reconcile this transition in light of the magisterium of the church.
Right. So that was what I was going to get into after that short explanation. But I can read the words from Unam Sanctam that you were referencing. This is from Pope Boniface VIII, and I think you can correct me if I'm wrong. 1302 is when it was written. 1301, something like that.
Something like that, beginning of the 14th century.
Yeah. So it's a very short encyclical, and this is sort of the heart of it. He says, both therefore are in the power of the church, that is to say, the spiritual and the material sword. But the former is to be administered for the church, but the latter by the church. The former in the hands of the priest, the latter by the hands of kings and soldiers, but at the will and sufferance of the priest. However, one sword ought to be subordinated to the other, and temporal authority subjected to spiritual power. So he's saying that this still echoes the teaching of the Gelasian Dyarchy, because the temporal sword is wielded um, by the hands of the kings and soldiers, but is wielded for the church. So we see this that the sword, there's two swords that are given, one to the church, one to the temporal power, but the temporal power has to, even though it gets to wield that sword, it has to wield it in subordination to the spiritual power. So that still preserves the Gelasian teaching that um, the temporal and the spiritual both get their power immediately from God, rather than the temporal getting their power immediately through the spiritual. Once again, as I mentioned before, the temporal power has is its use of the sword is only legitimate if it administers it for the church, as Pope Boniface VIII says. Does that answer or mostly answer the question?
I see. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think later we're definitely gonna go over the what the medieval popes say, and I think we're also gonna go over in that article the Augustinian view, the more Augustinian view, and the Whig Thomism view that are sort of contrary to the integralist view, the Gelasian Dyarchy, just so we can sort of see by see by contradiction, like more clearly what integralism is. Um,
You know, it'd also be nice to look at Saint Bellarmine in that as well.
oh, okay. Do you know?
Cause he writes pretty extensively um, about different forms of government. Well, I don't know. He writes a good bit about different forms of government.
Okay, can you guys post any sources? Because I have Pope Boniface VIII, but I don't think I have Saint Peter Damian or what were the other popes or what were some of the popes you mentioned, Jacob?
There is also a document that wasn't published. It was more of like a note. It's called Dictatus Papae, and it was written by Gregory VII.
Oh, is that Gregory the Great?
I don't think so.
Oh no, okay.
Gregory the Great is Gregory the First.
Gregory the First. Okay.
Mhm.
Displaying my amazing church knowledge here. And then William, you said Saint Robert Bellarmine. So Saint Peter Damian,
Yeah.
Gregory the Seventh, and then Saint Robert Bellarmine. Okay, I'll have to take a look at those and uh, weave those into the uh, the next one. Um, so one other point that I wanted to make, which is very important here, in terms of like this not being a monarchy, this only has to do with the relationship between the church and state. This doesn't have to do with the composition of the state itself. So this is not saying that the state itself needs to be a diarchy. No, like ideally, the state itself would be a monarchy, actually. Um, it's just that in the relationship between church and state, it's a diarchy. Um, I don't know if that makes sense. There's also, democracy and other forms of government are also allowed, but I think monarchism is the ideal. Obviously, maybe not attainable in certain cases, but certainly the ideal composition for the temporal state. So I just wanted to make that part clear too. Um,
Okay.
do I guess yeah, I guess we can. I was thinking maybe we could like do some mock objections and respond to them, but I think it'd be better if we waited until discussing the other points of view that are post-integralism, because then we can really get into it there. So unless
Mhm.
people have any other comments or questions or anything like or suggestions or anything like that, um, yeah, I guess now would be the time.
Yeah, I'd like to make the suggestion that we look a little deeper into sort of the role of the Pope in crowning kings in the Middle Ages. Because, like I said, originally it was believed that all temporal rulers were answerable to the emperor, and were also who could be elevated to the position of kingship was very much a prerogative of the Holy Roman Emperor. But later on, around the time of the investiture controversy, we see one kingdom after another slipping out from underneath the influence and the say-so of the Holy Roman Emperor and simply bypassing him and asking the Pope for a blessing for a coronation. And that seems to that seems to be sort of a usurpation of the imperial prerogatives within the Gelasian framework.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, we can definitely take a look at that. Yeah, that sounds like a doozy. Um, well, so for this exact grouping of people, unfortunately, Jacob will not be able to join us for the next few podcasts. So I think what we'll do is I'll continue on examining this article, and then once we're done with that, then I think because it'll take a little time, I think we can go back and revisit with Jacob when he comes back, revisit the article sort of in hindsight and see how it applies practically to that situation, because that sounds like a really interesting discussion. Um, all right, so I think hopefully in the next podcast we can have someone else, a third person join. I'm going to ask someone to help us out, but hopefully this crew of me, William, and Jacob should be the main group here going forward. All right. Anybody with any final comments, questions, suggestions?
No, not for me.
All right. Well, sweet. That means we get to. So me and William and Jacob came up with three random questions. So I have a random number generator in front of me, and we're going to find out which topic we're going to be discussing for the next episode, right along with you guys. So it should be pretty exciting. Um, there are 9 possible candidates. I guess with Jacob gone for the next few, if we get a 7, 8, or 9, then we'll throw that to the we'll toss that to the next person who joined the other person who joins the podcast if he's able to make it. And then if we get a 1 through 6, then it'll be either me or William presenting for the random section next time. All right, here we go. 3, 2, 1, generate. Oh, it's a 9. Okay, that means Michael, if he's able to make it, gets put on the spot. Um, all right. Thank you all for listening. Wait, what were you gonna say, William?
Is Mike is I was just gonna ask, is are you fine with that, Jacob? If Michael presents on the topic?
Yeah, I think that's
Topic now?
fine. I might draw up some notes as to what I really meant with the question, but other than that, yeah, I'm fine with that.
Awesome.
Okay. I think we're just gonna let him choose a completely new question and then let you present on your own questions. Uh, is that okay?
That is also fine.
All right, sweet. So he gets to come up with something. All right. Thank you all for listening. I think we just crossed 1 hour, so good time to stop. From me, uh, Jacob Kubas, and William Burnham Fleck, thank you all for listening, and God bless.